Hello and welcome to another installment of our Scholar Spotlight series. Today we have with us Kieran O'Meara from the University of St. Andrews. Thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Yes. The purpose of this discussion will be to explore how we can use film and popular culture as a source of philosophizing. In this case, the body of films and streamable television shows that constitute the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU, will undergo exploration. This short talk will be split into two parts. The first seeks to engage with film as a source of philosophical and indeed also political discourse. Why should we think about philosophy when we engage with film? What about pop cinema can be philosophical? After outlining that film and cinema may be understood as philosophy in action, the wealth of philosophical discourse embedded within the MCU will be explicated. We love explication here. What can Loki tell us about temporality and the philosophy of religion? In what manner is the Age of Ultron defined by its wooden condition? What do Iron Man and Descartes share? What is it for the Avengers to assemble? These questions and more we will address in our marvelous questions. So in this marvelous thinking, the MCU as philosophy in action, Kieran O'Meara, you take it away.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you and the Launcher Philosophy Fiction. Rather nice to see that somebody had actually read my work, which is rare. Let alone enjoyed it enough to actually ask me to speak about it as part of their Scholar Spotlight series, right?
Oh, yes.
So I should really begin with a handful of caveats, to be honest, which is always a great way to start any talk, right? Primarily, my background is political theory. And even then, my field of research concerns international relations and international political theory. So my cognitive instincts and hermeneutic apparatus kind of tend to sit within that horizon in the first place. Saying that, I'll consistently endeavor to ensure that I don't veer too far from strictly philosophical discourse, mostly because otherwise I could bore the back legs off of a donkey if I don't do so. Because I can do that talking about politics all day. Secondly, you ought to know that I am not a huge Marvel die-hard fan, sadly. I watch these films and streamed series in the same manner as everybody else, by either waiting for something better to watch or to procrastinate in those final hours of the day before I can sleep. So you all now know I do not consider myself neither a philosopher nor a die-hard Marvel fanboy, which is a great start considering the title for this talk, right? Nonetheless, I've always been a cinephile, either that or a very, very eager procrastinator, I think. The last one is what my mum says. So I've always just assumed everybody enjoyed movies to the point where their Saturdays would be spent reading and then watching 4 or 5 films at a time. And actually, it was only when I began working at my local cinema to pay for my postgraduate studies that I grasped the social, political, pedagogical, and philosophical importance of film. And it's this very salience that I would like to share with you today by the exploration of the MCU and its output. So let's start with the journey that we're going to take. I hope it's a journey. I hope it's a journey. I hope it's not clunky. So we'll start by looking at film and thought broadly, looking at why exploring film is significant in itself. This will include a discussion of Marvel as a political discourse, Mostly because I can't help myself. I have to do some political theory. And from here, we'll look at film as philosophy in action, and also the implications of this. And this is before the development of the claim, of this particular claim, through the exposition, there's that word again, of the Marvel films and the MCU. So the first thing we've got to tackle is, how do film and thought constellate broadly? That's got to be the first thing, the first sort of hurdle we traverse. So there are many ways that we can think about the effect that film has. Through popular film and now cinematic television, we get a glimpse of how our public philosophies manifest themselves into narratives. They spread by active, moving light onto screen as if butter slid across the face of toast. I know, right? Isn't that a great one? On the screen, we encounter ourselves, our norms, our popular narratives, our logics, and our values. And all of this is through a happenstance of light, color, and sound. In this way, film and television has always held a deep-seated, reflective relation to the aesthetic, philosophical, and even political. And it's useful as a mirror to observe our cultural and epistemological milieu, certainly. I have always considered film, well, not always, ever since working in a cinema, I have considered film to be like the condensed vapor on a very, very cold window pane. It kind of reflects ourselves back and our condition back. And so we can view it ourselves, right? So it's very much a way of being able to observe a condition that we are in at any point. So this, for example, has been one of the many qualities that make up the project of one particular philosopher, a number of philosophers, but one of them that's particularly significant is Slavoj Žižek. So one of the most prominent philosophers of the contemporary era, Žižek exposes film as a materialized, distilled cultural syrup of ideology, whereby the spectator of a given popular film may reflectively prod and critique a certain false unconsciousness in a Marxist psychoanalytical frame or tone. You see what I did there? So film has always been there for us to explore philosophical undertones and outputs, allowing us to gaze onto ourselves and our socio-cultural constructions. To be honest with you, this option has just been rarely executed until the contemporary era. In the history of film, the focus way, way back 100 years ago is more the technical aspect of film as opposed to the way it affects society, which is fair. You know, I don't think a lot of us are talking about the way in which, like, I mean, we do now, but because we have sort of broad-based sociology, but lots of people aren't writing papers on how effective TikTok is as a sociological device, right? They will do in the coming years, right? They will begin to do so. So film kind of follows the same patterns. Also, I remember reading once in sort of a long history of film that it was never expected that film would take off. I mean, even if you think of in the 1920s when you have films like The Jazz Singer, it was never expected that the talkie would be popular, which is a hilarious misjudgment when you think about that. So yeah, so part of this can be explained by the recent synthesis of classical political and social theory with cultural analysis. So when I first thought about this and explored this, the thinkers I was drawn to were Jacques Rancière, Gilles Deleuze, and Roland Barthes. So in the case of Rancière, in his Intervals of Cinema, he connects cinema to literature and theatre as social phenomena. So with literature, he argues cinema takes its narrative conventions, whilst equally effacing its images and its philosophy, rejecting theatre, but fulfilling the dream of theatre itself, of what theatre seeks to be. Such a critique he then relays back to his radical egalitarianism, post-Marxist aesthetics, alongside the question of actually, what is it to be a spectator? That's a cool question. That's a really, really cool question for aesthetics. Normally, we're so concerned with the object of aesthetics, we do in fact forget that it requires a subject, which is kind of cool. So Perhaps not, who knows? So equally, the post-modern perspective of Gilles Deleuze in Cinema 1 and 2, alongside the reflective perspective offered by Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida, completely adapt how we should indeed think about film. So in the case of Deleuze, cinema is itself isolated as the only mode of philosophical activity that combines thought with imagination in a relationship with time, allowing thinking itself to pass on to a transcendental plane beyond that of the aesthetics one is experiencing. And if that sounds complicated, try reading Deleuze. For Deleuze, all things stem back to the movement at the heart of cinema. So the etymological root of cinema comes from the German is kino, that's what they use for the word cinema, but that even stems back to an old Greek term of kinesis. And kinesis is movement itself. So the first ever word that was used for the cinematic projector was the cinematograph, which then became kinemat, which then became kino and cinema. So we're always should be talking about sort of the drawing of light or the movement of light whenever we're talking about cinema. And that idea of motion, of movement, is at the heart of Deleuze's grasp. So through this, cinema becomes a creative philosophical activity. It's able to forge new concepts out of its transcendent and kinetic character. So what we see in Deleuze, rather significantly, is that cinema and film become text, which is cool because then you can interpret it as text. I love that. That's how you always know that someone's like a bit of a philosopher, because they go, oh, text, I can interpret that. So Roland Barthes, similarly, focuses on the notion of the image. So in his work, Camera Lucida, an excellent set of reflections on photography, whilst simultaneously a eulogy to his mother, Barthes conceived of the photographic image as the death of a single moment in time. I love this, actually. This changed my life. So a constellation of objects are frozen in time and left to ossify when they're photographed. So photography is thus the destruction of the moment of the present itself for Barthes. Extending this, should we conceive of film as the massacre of time at 24 frames per second, perhaps? And beyond this, does this make stop motion animation, for instance, in fact, the only life-giving or Promethean form of cinema? Because it's like puppeteering with a parade of dead fossilized moments. I love that idea, right? Animation is so cool because of that, right? It's interesting how we think about photography as encapsulating and fossilizing a moment in time. So yeah, so one manner in which we've seen film theory merge with the philosophical is through the framework of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, rather famously. So focusing on exposing capitalist ideology embedded within the phenomena of mass culture. Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer discuss much of modern film as part of the culture industry. In this, the production of mass entertainment cannot be separated from the total socio-political relations of the capitalist mode of production. And alongside that, how mass culture in contemporary capitalism goes some way to reproduce the very ideological conditions for the reproduction of capitalism itself, as opposed to the enrichment of creativity. So one could connect this back to an Althusserian notion of ideological apparatus, if one willed, but that's a whole other discourse going into that kind of connection and going into that kind of Marxian thinking. So throughout their dialectic of enlightenment, Adorno and Horkheimer utilize Hollywood film as an exemplar of the culture industry. So for instance, they state that, and this is a quote, movies and radio need no longer pretend to be art. The truth that they are nothing but business is used as an ideology to legitimize the rubbish they intentionally produce, end quote. So here, film is inherently a mass product as the thing itself. To quote a longer passage, the whole world is made to pass through the filter of the culture industry. The old experience of the moviegoer who sees the world outside as an extension of the film they have just left, because the latter is intent upon reproducing the world of everyday perceptions, is now the producer's guideline. The more intensely and flawlessly their techniques duplicate empirical objects, the easier it is today for the illusion to prevail that the outside world is the straightforward continuation of that presented on the screen. This purpose has been furthered by mechanical reproduction, signaling Walter Benjamin, since the lightning takeover of the sound film. Real life is becoming indistinguishable from the movies. The sound film, far surpassing the theatre of illusion, leaves no room for imagination or reflection on the part of the audience, who is unable to respond within the structure of the film, yet deviate from its precise detail without losing the thread of the story. Hence, the film forces its victims to equate it directly with reality. Okay, that's a bit of a long quote, but what we can see there is their exploration of the culture industry in this way, of Hollywood film in this way. So we can see this even as far as superhero culture broadly is concerned. So let's take one illustration in particular, that of the late, great Mark Fisher. So in his Capitalist Realism, which is an excellent text, by the way, Fisher highlights how mass culture and ideology ultimately limit our very capability to imagine a life without capitalism, to the point at which any alternative aside from the capitalist mode of production has become simply unimaginable. Remaining within a critical tradition, Fisher outlines this in his unfinished work, Acid Communism, which sadly he died whilst writing. The nub of the problematique with critical theory, and especially Adorno's frame that he mentions, is that we are invited to endlessly examine the wounds of damaged life under capital. The idea of a world beyond capital is dispatched into a utopian beyond. So in this, for Fisher, art and film, thinking of it in Adorno's terms, only marks our distance from utopia. So Fisher repudiates the notion that to engage with contemporary mass culture, even to amass a body of critique against the capitalist culture industry, is to somehow be absorbed into its schema. Interesting. So throughout his exceptionally insightful body of work, Fisher carefully analyzes and investigates illustrations of mass culture, art, music, and film in order to critically locate within their contents those intellectual relations to the major philosophical, political, and social dialogues of the time. One such of these illustrations are his reflections on Batman Begins. I love these. So here, Fisher surveys the representation of finance capital, psychoanalytical forms of paternalism, incoherencies of representing capitalism, postmodern reflexivity, and the ethics of distinguishing justice from revenge. So Fisher not only makes the case for, but indeed demonstrates in practice that although film is embedded into the fabric of the capitalist productive and reproductive relations, its contents may provide some insight reflexively into the intellectual dialogues of the day, tapping into certain socio-political or even philosophical themes that lend themselves to critical analysis. One of my favorite things that Fisher had ever said was that it's interesting how around 2012 there were more films discussing the end of the world than there were the end of capitalism, very famously, right? So the very fact that we can see how in Fisher's frame, how capital really does take a hold of our imagination to this extent. Film allows us to observe this and provide a critique of that. Nonetheless, the philosophical discourse I would like to take from concerns not only, well, not one of the great continental Marxist or post-structural thinkers, but that of the British philosopher Stephen Mulhall. So in his acclaimed 2002 work on film, Stephen Mulhall brought film theory, aesthetics, and philosophy together in order to form a deeply original text that has become a staple of examining films for their philosophically and socially meaningful residue. So Mulhall isolates film as a mode of philosophy through the category of action, as philosophy in action. So a lot of this text concerns Mulhall's examination of the Alien series, and alongside that, Blade Runner. To be honest with you, I don't think it takes a long time to concede that the early films in the Alien franchise were able to explore the angst of otherness in a way that few films have. I mean, I remember watching that when I was about 13, 14 for the first time and being terrified of going into like any dark space at all, right? And Blade Runner was able to explore the boundaries of what it was to be an emotive human. So in discussion of his project, Mulhall states that I do not look to these films as handy or popular illustrations of views and arguments properly developed by philosophers. I see them rather as themselves reflecting on and evaluating such views and arguments, as thinking seriously and systematically about them in just the same way that philosophers do. Such films are not philosophy's raw material, are not a source for its ornamentation. They are philosophical exercises. They are philosophy in action. Film as philosophizing. So film is rarely utilized as a source of philosophical inquiry, and this is something that Mulhall admits. And to be honest, television is used even rarer still. I'm sure at some point someone has written a book on the philosophy of soap operas or something, or something like that. Yeah, I'd love to read the one on Neighbours. That'd be great. Popular film and now cinematic television, we get a glimpse of how our public philosophies manifest themselves into narratives. Okay, we see that. So what I would like to do is I would like to utilize this notion to show not only how film can be explored as philosophy in action, but do this by applying it to a mode of film that's been deemed by Martin Scorsese, or sorry, I mean by some, as being the inversion of what cinema is. In all seriousness, though, I can't let that slide. So on Scorsese, I think this hinges on a distinction between film and cinema, which I think Scorsese grasps but doesn't communicate. But anyway, we can come back to that and talk about that later if you want to. Nonetheless, even the most pop cultural cinematic series can be considered philosophy in action if we just take the time to look at it, if we just take the time to think about it and use it even as a pedagogical tool. And that's what we're going to try and do over the course of the next couple of minutes, next little while. So how is the MCU philosophy in action? So although often being cited for its underlying socio-political and philosophical themes, the MCU has tended to limit these themes to undertones. And in this, they've never quite overtly brought the philosophical dilemmas they play out between its lycra-wearing characters to the clear surface, but keeping it present in murky depths alone. So the MCU officially came to the fore with Jon Favreau's 2008 Iron Man, before disseminating more than 30 other films. Just thinking about that, more than 30 other films over the course of 5 phases since, and with a 6th phase to have begun by the spring of 2025, if they still have funding, or actors for that matter, right? But hey ho, yeah. On with the strikes, love that. So throughout these films, philosophical and political undertones have been present without a doubt. So let's start with one. What we're going to try and do is we're going to go through sort of different examples. Some of them will be thinner than others, but we're just going to try and engage with this sort of film as philosophy in action. So in the earlier comics, and indeed in the earlier films prior to the MCU, we do see that a central focus of Stan Lee's work is the exploration of othering and race. So for instance, in X-Men, we observe how a sort of Levinasian notion of alterity or of otherness is dealt with through the discourse surrounding the other, as opposed to the idealism of the hero or anti-hero's journey. So Joseph Dorowski explores this in his 2014 work called X-Men and the Mutant Metaphor, which is a great read. So for Dorowski, the category of mutant becomes distinctly a category of difference, and thus constructs a requirement of both separation and externality from the norm. So this is observable at a number of points throughout the X-Men comics, but most succinctly in two ways. First of all, the mutants are sought out and expunged from society, forced to live separately, be that at Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, or even in Genosha and Krakoa, which are kind of like end up being like, can you believe this? I don't even like expert ended up doing the research on this. Down this way, right? So now I know the complete history of like the mutant nation of Genosha. But even so, right? Right. So you end up with sort of nation state sovereignty kind of emerging out of this as a result of alterity, right? As a result of this kind of othering. And secondly, Magneto's status as an individual clearly othered by virtue of the character's significant backstory as a Holocaust survivor. I think that's exceptionally significant because it's not a usual thing that we see in Marvel discourse, is to have such trauma very clearly displayed as the backstory of a particular character. That, to me, signals an attempt to really get to the heart of alterity, to really get to the heart of the process of othering, to ensure that your lead villain, he isn't really a villain, but your lead anti-hero is themselves a bundle of trauma that has experienced a particular kind of experience. Yeah, so I think that's particularly significant. So yeah, this is what we can perceive in the older comics. The notion of superhero or mutant as outsider, as discourse that Dorowski connects back to a very clear history of Marvel's attempt to explore these themes in tandem with the context of race and civil rights in the US when the first X-Men issue is released in 1963. So this perhaps changes by the time the MCU is in full swing, and the Avengers sit at the heart of the state apparatus as the only hope for humanity's salvation. Right, you see a flip there, right? We go from being completely othered to being at the center of the state. So we can already see that the theme of alterity and otherness is explored and experimented with in this particular manner. So what does happen when, as in the case of Magneto, the desire to protect the ostracized, the other, requires violence? At what point does the status of otherness permit the individual to utilize protective violence simply in order to ensure the recreation of their subjective and conscious existence? This takes us to the question of ethics. All right, so next film, Captain America Civil War is one I'd like to go over. So this saw a feud between the supergroup assemblage, the Avengers, concerning a conflict of ethical frameworks towards legislative restriction over the group itself. So here, Tony Stark, Iron Man, took an increasingly million utilitarian stance supporting restriction, and Steve Rogers, Captain America, affirmed the ontological attitude as an extension of his mistrust of government agencies and immovable will for choice, which is interesting. So the latter is quite frankly unsurprising, especially considering Rogers's superpower is materially and ideologically twofold. In the first case, in his physical abilities, I used to look like that, but alas, right, you know, studying politics does things to you. And secondly, that he is ontologically American values made manifest, whatever that entails, right? A kind of idealized notion of what American values could be. So the reason why I say this is because, interestingly, Captain America arrives in print in 1941. And so what we can see is that Captain America gains superpower status precisely at the moment where the United States entered into its final process of becoming a political superpower itself. So this illustrates the case as to how US normative power internationally and Captain America can be interpreted as manifestations of one and the same phenomenon. That's just me being deep there. So as a detour from this, there is actually some discourse that discusses the whole Marvel series as an extension of US normative power in international history, quietly in existence in a number of different journal articles. There's always been this quiet discourse. So here we see the rise of superheroes closely connected to classical liberal values in the 1940s and throughout the Cold War. Yet post 9/11, and with the beginning of the war on terror, this kind of notion of power, political hubris, and of global responsibility clearly fold back into the mix. And this is also, I was thinking about this earlier on, so this isn't too far from the global discourse set by Kofi Annan in 2005, that the United Nations held the responsibility to protect citizens of states for whom their sovereign governments had usurped their rights-based obligations, which is interesting because we can see that notion about global responsibility to protect humanity really, really comes to the fore. And that's a complete change from how we see sort of superhero films in the past. So yeah, for more on that, I would recommend the work of Christine Muller and Terence McSweeney. They're really good sort of writers on this. So returning to the conflict of ethical frameworks in the film, perhaps this could even be transferred into sort of more standardized normative philosophy. So whereby the divide in the supergroup imitates the division between classical liberals, pro-minimal state, negative liberty on the one hand, defined by a desire for non-intervention to construct oneself as a rights-bearing free agent. So we see that in the liberalism of Steve Rogers. And modern liberals on the other, pro-state intervention, pro-positive liberty, determining that there must be rules and limits that are not broken for the individual to develop. And we see this in the late stage socially liberal capitalism of Tony Stark. So here we see the ideological, political, and philosophical syrup lying within the very composition of the film. Additionally, within this, Thor engages throughout the series with a number of events that push him to follow the virtue ethics of an Aristotelian kind. So at first we see his embodiment as the vice of excess, a figure of ego and hubris and just way too much power. He's a god. Nonetheless, by the time we get to Endgame, it's almost as if we see a completely different character. And that's one that slowly wishes to inch towards a condition of eudaimonia and the rational golden mean of virtue between deficiency, we famously see this as Fat Thor, which I wasn't too keen on, but hey-ho, and excess, right? So and that's what we see in the initial film. So thus, it really isn't surprising that Thor remains the manifestation of this in remaining neutral during the feud in Civil War. He simply operates the space of the golden mean throughout. For a better discussion of this, see Mark D. White's The Avengers and Philosophy. The first chapter in that really kind of explores that notion. Honestly, don't get me started on Thor, though. Like, otherwise, I'll start talking about Love and Thunder, and then I'll just be going to bed angry that they were able to set up Christian Bale's performance as, like, the living Nietzschean, like, Twilight of the Idols perfectly as Gore the God Butcher, prepared to finally even explore some notion of the Ubermensch, and instead you got Russell Crowe's butchery of a Greek accent. I can't. I can't, right? Anyway, I digress. So now, I know on the awesome flyer for this event, it featured an amazing picture of Descartes as Superman, which I loved, right? So let's explore this one. What do Iron Man and Descartes share? Sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? Yeah. So what it is for Tony Stark to be Iron Man shifts across the time scale of the MCU. So for Descartes, his central question in his first meditations is how one can devise a method to know. It is methodologically concerned about epistemology and how this refracts back into a process of conscious subjectivation. So what we're talking about here is being able to know the I. As like I as conscious I, not like I as in like the eye on my face. Right? Exactly, right? So interestingly, we see Tony Stark undertake a long process of subjectivation also. Here, the process of interpreting what it is to exist as his conscious subject is continuous throughout the series. He goes from grasping I'm Iron Man as some sort of ego-driven playboy in the same manner we can sort of see with Bruce Wayne, perhaps, as billionaire tech bro investor by day and defender of all that is just and voluntary side hustle by night. So we see this shift to the declaration of his known subject as Iron Man itself. So Stark takes the back seat, and we observe the subjective reversal of sorts to seeing Iron Man becoming who Stark is. There's a flip. So hence the Iron Man plot can be interpreted as a discourse concerning ontological mediation that must rest on an epistemological foundation of deduction. What we see is a consistent process of subjective mediation. Interestingly, by the time we observe the squared circle of this reversal in Endgame, the three waves of doubt that Descartes discusses as part of his method are already in play. So illusion, dreaming, and deception are all present in the metaphysics of the MCU that we've come to know. So illusion and dreaming are very clearly epistemological limitations in the MCU. All one has to do is think of Loki, Doctor Strange, or the Jekyll and Hyde post-structural inside-outside co-construction of Bruce Banner and the Hulk, which is, of course, another existential discourse. They love them. So deception and the notion of the evil demon is also very much present in this epistemological frame. So Descartes, in his Meditations on First Philosophy, says some malicious demon of the utmost power and cunning has employed all his energies in order to deceive me. I shall think that the sky, the earth, colours, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely the delusions of dreams which he has devised to ensnare my judgment. We literally observe this process of doubt when, during Avengers Infinity War, Thanos sets a trap to secure the Reality Stone in an act known as the Ambush in Nowhere, spelt with a K. This epistemological undertones here are just overbrimming. They're very, very clear. So Thanos becomes the Deus Deceptor when he finds the Reality Stone, and he declares reality is often disappointing. That is, it was. Descartes forges what we know as his rationalist method of Cartesian universal or global skepticism and doubt to arrive famously at the cogito. Or the cogito, everyone seems to say it differently, right? Right, so Tony Stark is faced consistently with a metaphysics that forces such doubt, leaving him to arrive not at I think, therefore I am, but at his final snappy sort of click moment, clarification and ontological hailing, I'm Iron Man. Precisely at the moment he engages in an action he knows will call him to fade into the void. So in answer to the question, what does Descartes share with Tony Stark? That amidst all of this, they are able to anchor their ontological assumptions in their knowledge claims to being. Fun. All right, so now this entire venture for me, matching up Mulhall's film as philosophy in action with the MCU, really came to being after watching the first season of Loki. So Loki is interesting, entertaining, and a thought-provoking series. It's not unlike other projects like WandaVision or What If, and it's created actually by the successful screenwriter and producer known for their work on Rick and Morty and other MCU projects. So this guy's called Michael Waldron. I like his work. I don't know. You know when you get attached to like a random name that you see on screen, and you're like, yay. I like it when they do these things. So Loki holds all of the elements to become the archetypal successful illustration of the synergy between feature film quality cinematics and television that we as home viewers have kind of become accustomed to. And it has been very popular. So indeed, there was over 10.9 million views of the first episode of season 2 in the first 3 days of its streaming on Disney Plus, which is a new record that is absolutely huge. I was one of those people. In fact, I probably had about 0.9 million views of that 10.9, right, to be honest. Right, I was sat there kind of like casually eating crisps, like, oh wait, I missed that bit. The dog came in, take the dog out, right, now we got to start again. So half of that is me. So what's the premise of Loki? After swiping the Tesseract, a magical cosmic cube, during the events of Avengers Endgame, and utilizing it to escape to an alternative sort of timeline, Loki is brought to the mysterious Time Variance Authority, which is known as the TVA. So the TVA is a bureaucratic organization that exists outside of time and space with the purpose of monitoring entire predetermined events that constitute the course of multiversal time. So in escaping the Avengers with the Tesseract, Loki became a time variant, an illegal parallel version of himself that should never have been, and as such risks the dissolution of the timeline that the TVA worked tirelessly to uphold by removing dangerous variants that risk dissolving the fabric of this predetermined time. They call that pruning. So at the TVA, Loki is given a choice: to be erased from existence as protocol demands, or help the TVA maintain the timeline, halting a greater threat to the multiversal order. Another Loki variant called Sylvie, who wishes to rid the multiverse of the TVA's control in favor of variant-free will. So subsequently, Loki becomes trapped in a mysterious thriller, traveling across time, space, history, and the multiverse within his own story of mischief. I actually took that from a thing that wrote about it, right? I read that and was like, oh, within his own story of mischief. I love that. To discover who controls the TVA and how to command its power over the temporal fabric of the universe. So by the end of the first series, spoilers, it turns out that the TVA is staffed exclusively by variants. Loki falls in love with himself through Sylvie, which is a quite yet interesting discourse on externalized manifested narcissism, quite frankly. The moment I saw this, I was like, that's fun. And then I wondered if I met a variant of myself, would I be like, hey? I hope not. So lastly, the person controlling the TVA, sitting at the center of all time, is He Who Remains, an office title, the office holder of which is a variant of Kang the Conqueror. And this is played by the now problematic Jonathan Majors. So Loki is by far the best exploration of film as philosophy in action, because there are just so many ways by which philosophical exercises are discussed within its text. So the one that I'd like to pick up on first, there's so many, but the big one that I remember thinking of the first time I saw it concerns the philosophy of religion. So there is a disagreement among religious philosophers as to whether God is eternal or everlasting. If God is everlasting, then it exists within time. If it is eternal, then it exists outside of time. So if God exists within time, it's everlasting. This is to say, it was there at the beginning of time and will continue to exist forever until the end. So returning to Loki, once battling through a number of time periods and TVA Minutemen, dodging being pruned, Loki and Sylvie arrive at the Citadel at the end of time, where they find He Who Remains. Around the Citadel sits the sacred timeline as a conglomerate of multiversal timelines weaved into a single halo by a temporal loom. Imagine like a big hula hoop with like a house on a rock in the middle of it. So at the center of this circle sits the Citadel and He Who Remains, who panoptically observes every point in every timeline, so to direct the Minutemen of the TVA to engage with their pruning of variants. This led me immediately to Boethius, mostly because I just did a class on it and was like, when I saw it, sometimes that's nice when you do a class on something and then you're like, as I say, like set stuff in your face watching television and you're like, oh my God. So in his Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius described time as a circle, and human experience is of traveling round the circle, whereas an eternal being sits at the center and experiences all points on the circle simultaneously. So the concept of an eternal God is slightly more difficult to imagine. If God exists outside of time, then it has no beginning or end, as these concepts only make sense within time. So that leads Boethius to describe God's relationship with time, and thus us, as eternal. So he sort of explains this by talking about the whole simultaneous and perfect possession of boundless life, which was fun because I'm almost certain that is perhaps unconsciously, that is almost exactly something you would expect a Marvel villain to say. So interesting. So whereas humans and variants experience time in succession, one moment at a time, an eternal being experiences all moments simultaneously, as he who remains does. So building on Boethius's description, two philosophers, Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann, distinguish between two types of simultaneity. A very, very famous paper. So they talk about T-simultaneity, which is temporal simultaneity. So this applies to temporal beings within time, like humans, like us. So humans can perceive two things happening simultaneously in the present moment only. The other kind is E-simultaneity, which applies to atemporal beings, those that sit outside of time, like God. So God can perceive multiple things happening simultaneously at all times, what we would call the past, present, and future, from the perspective of an eternal present. For example, from God's perspective, it can perceive you on your 7th birthday whilst simultaneously perceiving you on your 27th birthday. Oh gosh, I remember my 27th birthday. Wouldn't that be nice to go back to that? So Loki, with this in view, thus becomes a commentary on E-simultaneity, T-simultaneity, Boethius, and how from Loki's perspective, the viewer is able to experience both safely from our mortal position in the latter. So Loki, in fact, goes on to answer the question that we've all experienced a student ask, which is, how could God be outside of time and yet intervene in it? The answer is a retro-Kafkan police bureaucracy that sits within the space between multiversal temporality, pruning that which doesn't follow the plan, i.e. TVA, the TVA. So what we get with Loki is we finally get an illustration which hasn't really been imagined before as to the manner in which God could do both. God could be both T-simultaneity, engage in T-simultaneity and E-simultaneity, which is kind of interesting, if we're in the discourse of philosophy of religion, of course. So now there are a number of other illustrations I could have gone through, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to mention a couple of outlines. So Loki could be conceived of as another Cartesian discourse about what it is to exist, be that as Richard E. Grant or an alligator, interpreting what qualities characterize one's own subject. Loki could also be thought of as a Platonic discourse on the cave. So what we see is one of his variants attempting to return all variants to their position on the timeline as an attempt of forcing to be free. In Owen Wilson, we certainly see in season 2, without spoilers, sort of a representation of the prisoner who doesn't wish to be freed out of fear. Thus it asks, what is it to be freed temporally as a variant of oneself? And this returns us to a question of alternaity, which is kind of interesting. Another question which is kind of interesting is about Ultron. I always conceived of Ultron in a half-baked way of one of my favorite quotes by Kant. It's a great way to start a sentence. One of my favorite quotes by Kant is that from the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made, which is a great quote. And I think that this is not only commentary on original sin, but is an interesting commentary on what it is to be human and engage with the human condition. Ultron is only as crooked as Tony Stark is, as an extension of himself. So part of Ultron's, as I put this to you once, as a part of his wooden condition, is that very connection to the limits of Tony Stark's logic. And so we can see that the outcome of, I wouldn't necessarily say original sin, but that's secularized. The outcome of original sin is AI, interestingly, in that discourse, which is just a huge topic, right? Which is just a massive discourse currently. It seems to be something that everyone's talking about at the moment, and I'm still trying to find a way in to publish. Another one which is kind of cool is Avengers assembling. So are Avengers an assemblage, and what does that include? We see this in the discourse about the ship of Theseus, which is a comment by Vision in WandaVision. But my question about Avengers assembling is that, does that include villains? Does that include Loki? Does that include Thanos? Are they part of that assemblage? Right? Without these particular villains, you end up with a different kind of assemblage. Does this include dead Avengers? Right? Does that include Tony Stark? Do we have a completely distinct mode of what the Avengers are now that you've lost some characters? Is this a different object? Another question we could talk about is determinism. Does Doctor Strange indicate that we're going in a linear fashion, irrespective of some kind of predetermined discourse? There's that moment in Endgame where he talks about, oh, I've seen a billion possibilities. Oh God, I love Benedict Cumberbatch so much, but just why? A billion possibilities, and this is the one. This is just the one where we win. That indicates a certain sense of predeterminedness, right? A sense of a predetermined universe. And so you could flip that back onto John Hick's discourse in Evil and the God of Love, where he would say that, like, yes, we can learn something from a predetermined universe because you have to have soul-making theodicy. So perhaps the whole purpose of Infinity Wars is to set up this soul-making theodicy to explore the predetermined nature of odds and time. But yeah, anyway, that's a lot of different ways that we can explore philosophy, or we can explore film as a philosophy of action. And I think the MCU really, really strikes home with that, simply because it allows us to see that any sort of pop culture, any sort of pop cinema really, really can engage back with philosophical questions, and we can explore them in different ways. Thank you. I hope that makes sense. I went on a bit longer than I wanted to, but yeah.
Fantastic. I love it. Um, I wonder, you mentioned late Nietzsche in his twilight years. I was struck about this question of the spectator and what it means to be a spectator. And that brought me back to his early years, my favorite, Birth of Tragedy. Do you think that there is maybe not necessarily a death of tragedy, but of a possible decline of, or maybe with all these iterations and having 30 movies in the five, just this production, that maybe the spectator is seeing too much of themselves on the screen, and maybe
yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the spectator is witnessing too much of themselves, and I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why fewer people are willing to engage with it. I also think that one of the biggest problems we have when we talk about Marvel and we talk about sort of how we spectate Marvel's like stuff and MCU stuff now is that, like, we watch it through Disney Plus, and that's a completely distinct experience to watching it like in the theater or in the cinema with other people. Like, I've always cast the cinema as being a part of the public realm precisely because it's a public experience in some way, right? There's something like that relates it back to the agora for me in some way, but you just don't have that when you're sat watching it in your living room, right? There isn't necessarily that public dimension. And so I think when it's just churning out film after film after film, not only does the actual sort of experience of the spectator shift, it dilutes. And that's the problem. Once it dilutes, I think it just sort of, one loses the purpose for spectating in the first place. I mean, I know that's why I haven't watched a lot of Marvel stuff. Like, I haven't even bothered watching Secret Invasion, or I haven't even bothered engaging with other bits and bobs that they've done, just because, like, life's too short to watch all these things. Right? Really is too short with Marvel at the moment. But yeah, and I think that they could. I mean, I was looking earlier at their kind of scheme for more films and more films and more films, and all I can think to myself is, I think from a political and economic perspective, I think they really are pushing the boundaries of how far you can sort of milk a commodity. And I think that's something we haven't necessarily seen before. We've never seen a film franchise pump out this many films that hasn't reached cult status. I mean, it does have cult status, but people still go and see these films and watch these films in their droves. And I think that's fascinating because they are the same stories consistently. There isn't necessarily a lot of distance, a lot of change, or even intrigue in different ways. Like I still think one of my favorite ones, one of my favorite sort of full stop, it was initially the X-Men discourse because it is different, it is distinct, it has a different kind of aesthetic. And I think it's interesting how that sort of faded. And there might be a bigger, deeper reason for why that's faded. I don't know. But then you have other things like Deadpool. Like Deadpool, I think, is a good example of how you can have something different, how you can have a distinct discourse going on. But I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to offer those in the chat an opportunity to ask a question.
Please.
How you doing over there, chat? Hanging out? No pressure.
No, yeah.
You may be just a spectator if you like. While folks are, generating questions, I must say I love your metaphors and your turns of phrase, all the imagery, playfulness. I love it. Thank you for bringing that.
I think oh, it's all right. I think there's something about metaphor that's fun. I tend to find with students that you just got to, like, I always ask whenever I have sort of classes, when we do icebreakers, I always try to insist that my students write down like their 3 top favorite films. And then I tend to keep a note of them because if I ever need metaphors, it's always the best place to go to, right? It's always the best place to kind of like begin with because everyone can recall images of like Uma Thurman in Pulp Fiction, right? Getting that adrenaline shot to the chest, right? Everyone can recall that, right? That's easily memorable. So you can kind of pull that out if you ever need to kind of like throw that out as a metaphor in some way.
Yes, yes. Oh, here we have a question. Jenna asks, I also have an interest in philosophy and media. Have you looked into games, TTRPGs, real-time D&D shows, and philosophy?
Okay, that's a really, really interesting question. Thank you for asking. I think that the only sort of discussion or the only sort of examination I've ever had on games really has been a sort of discourse about the limits of gaming worlds. So, for example, if we were to take certain kinds of games, I don't know, let's talk about, like, I don't know, something standard like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed, something simple like that. There's always a coded limit in that, right? So I always found myself wanting to go beyond these limits, right? I always like, but I want to go over there. That looks way more cool than where I am here. So perhaps if we can think about this in an increasingly metaphysical way, I know there are some that explore the discussion about gaming in relation to, again, philosophy of religion. It's not really something that I look at myself, but I have colleagues and friends that do explore. Perhaps this connects back to sort of creation stories and coding, right? The idea that maybe something like string theory or something like atoms are like the basis of the code that God never expected us to be able to hack or mod, right? That we was never expected to get to this point, right? So perhaps we are simply like, it's like Tron World. We are NPCs that have managed to become protagonists where we were never supposed to. And that's probably the full extent that I've ever really explored through games. But I do think it is an expanding field, and it is certainly something that I know people to talk about. As far as the politics of gaming goes, as I say, like, that's more my kind of thing, or the political theory of it. I know there is just tons of discourse in IR theory and international relations thinking about the interrelationship between sort of simulated killing and sort of PlayStation gaming, or things like Call of Duty and drone warfare. Loads of discussion on that at the moment. And that there is kind of like a relationship between that. It's sort of weird to think that in some sort of military base in Texas, you have a load of sort of very, very well-trained Call of Duty players that now fly drones over Pakistan, right? Which is really fascinating because that wouldn't have necessarily been conceived of as an effective Pac-Man, right, in the long term, right? So when you have like this kind of like technological movement, I do think you end up with changing discourses about how we can think about our social relations, how we can think about our political relations, and alongside that, our ethical and metaphysical relations. So in full answer to your question, I can't give you any names. So no, I've not looked into games or anything like that. There's only sort of rough thoughts or like rough pieces around, but I will on my Twitter. The moment we're done on my Twitter, I will like go and find like a couple, because I have a couple of journal articles on that sort of thing, so I'll post them up. Right?
That would be awesome.
I hope that answers.
Yeah. On that note, just the sort of distance that this gaming space could place between human agents and giving them the ability to destroy from afar. And do you think that there is a capacity to further others, or is there also just as equally a space to bring folks closer together?
Good question. Okay, so I always think that whenever we talk about technology, the person that I always think about, or whenever we kind of can think in these ways, I always think of a guy called Kretzmann, who once wrote about sort of the history of technology. I never really read it as a history. I read it more as a philosophy. And he kind of sets out his laws of technology. And one of his laws of technology, I believe it's the first, is technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral, it just is. And so I think that one of the things you can have is you always have the capability to connect people with things, to connect people with drones, with guns, with specific kind of guided missiles. But you also have the capacity in almost exactly the same technology to be able to connect millions of people throughout the Arab Spring, for example, right? So I think as much as you have the capability to, as I say, organize mass violence, and certainly state-directed violence, you always also organize transnational, what some of us would call inverted revolutionism, or a kind of transnational pacifism that you get from that. And technology, I think, really aids that. And it aids that precisely because we can communicate with one another in distinct ways. So one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, again, I've gone all political, but one of the things I'm working on at the moment is I'm working on what's called the A22 network. So the A22 network is like a group of sort of ecological protest groups that are very transnational in the way that they function. What I'm trying to understand is how do they use different digital means to coordinate protest. What's really fascinating is that you'll find that you have like a series of WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups that are utilized between leaders of horizontalist movements, of these different movements, that attempt to coordinate at different times and different days the blockages of certain kind of like rigging facilities, or the blockages of certain kind of oil refineries, right? I was just chatting with someone the other day about how a particular, like by standing outside a particular refinery in Louisiana, they were stopping sort of 4 or 5 days later the delivery of oil in North London, right? So you always have this capability to have transnationalism and technology merge and go hand in hand, to always an equal extent that you have the capability to inflict damage and violence. I always think in exactly the same way. Just has to be inverted in different ways. I actually think that's much more complicated, though. I think it's much more complicated to invert that kind of thing. But it can be done, and always can be done. And there's always examples of where it happens. So I think in a more philosophical sense, I think whenever we're talking about, and this is perhaps something we have to do more, is think philosophically about technology, is the way in which it sort of collapses space and time in certain regards. Like, for example, now, right, this is a really good example, right? It's currently 20 to 1 in the morning where I am, right? Yet I've completely forgotten about the temporal and spatial distinction between us, right? Like that is as beautiful as have it, or that is as ingenious and as sort of mind-bend guide a missile, right? So I always think as much as you have one, you always have the inversion of the other. And so we should always think certainly technologically, and after that philosophically, I think, on that regard.
Yeah.
It is cool. It's cool to think about and talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For the question, yeah, and how do you even begin to conceptualize a potential balance between those two, or in terms of the Marvel universe, good conquering evil, one conquering the other?
Yeah.
Will there always be a subversion? Is there an
yeah.
everlasting extension of the play between the two?
Yeah, perhaps. I certainly think so. I know there's a film theorist that I quite like. Is a guy called John Nelson, And one of the things that he talks about in one of his books about the relationship between film theory and philosophy is how we can always conceive of the hero's journey as being kind of like this long-standing discourse between realism and idealism. How the hero will always be some formulation of realist type, that it comes to save the day, so it comes to save the materiality of the world from someone wicked in some way. And the wicked individual is always principled. Think of Joker, right? I think is as much as we have kind of like a somewhat passive nihilism that Joker kind of displays, as opposed to an affirmative nihilism. It's still principle, right? Principle is seen through all the way to the end, right, with Joker. And that completely is juxtapositioned by the fact that you have Batman, whose entire sort of basis is good, bad, and very concrete, right, in that. So I do think that so long as you have this ongoing discourse between ethics, thinking, epistemology, morality, and also like political domains as well, and sociological domains, of this conversation between realism and idealism, you'll always have the space for superhero discourse, because you'll always have the space for some kind of rogue ideal versus what we know to be true, right, in some way, right? And that's always how it's portrayed. It's always portrayed as like the common sense theory of things versus the zealot in some regard. And so as long as you have that discourse broadly, I think it'll just sort of continue to go on. There is one thing that I do think about, though, in this regard, just thinking about it, is Graham Harman, who works on object-oriented ontology, right? He tries to put forward a very, very cool philosopher, actually, a very, very cool philosopher, kind of comes from an architectural background, but he discusses there being a potential breach between, less of a breach, more of an overcoming of idealism by realism, by sort of exploring what he calls a German realism, where you kind of invert Kant to some degree. And I think that's really, really cool, because I'd love to see like what would be the ethical perspective of that, because that could completely change the way in which we see certain kinds of discourses play themselves out when we talk about stuff like Marvel, when we talk about sort of these kind of narratives. How can there be a kind of German realist perspective on ethics, right? What would deontology thoroughly inverted look like if it's not based in idealism, but based in something that argues that, yes, we can never get to the thing in itself, but neither can anything else. Neither can this glass, neither can this pen. I can't get to the thing itself of this pen in the same way that I can't get to the thing itself of yourself, right? Or my mother or my father or anything else, right? Or the fact that if I were to, my sins, I smoke, right? But don't do it at home. Right? But if I think to myself, like, the smell of tobacco never touches the heat of the flame, right? So this isn't something that we are bound to. There is something like that is specifically us. It is something that all objects experience. And so I'd love to see how, when you plug that back into Kant, how that would kind of like reverberate in ethical discourse that we would see kind of play itself out in that kind of imaginative realm. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I've just gone rambled then, but maybe, probably.
I'm a big Husserl fan,
Oh, yeah,
all about phenomenology over here. So
yeah, love that.
I don't know if that would be a cop out, that sort of view of
No,
the phenomenological, and just sort of
no, not,
reaching that divide altogether.
yeah, absolutely.
But
Absolutely. No, I still like Husserl. I'm still one of those people that enjoys hermeneutics way, way too much. Well, not way too much, but to the point where I'm just so happy sat reading Gadamer. I'm just one of those people, right? So you got to read Schleiermacher, Dilthey, and also Husserl to kind of get there, and then kind of like move into Heidegger a little bit and be like, oh, let's flirt. But no, interesting.
I have my qualms about Heidegger, but oh gosh, he's
Don't we all? Don't
necessary.
we all? We all have our qualms about Heidegger in some way. So I had a student ask me the other day to explain him, and I was like, okay, where do you start with that, right? And then I said, right, go away, do some research. And then the very first question he asked was, what are the black books? And I was like, oh God, I thought we'd at least have like, I thought we'd at least get like to like an hour in before I could explain that he was a raging anti-Semite, right? In certain fields, although that's contested in some way, but even so, right? I'm just like, oh God. But it's fun to explore him. I still think his philosophy is so fascinating. That's one of the things that I've found that's really interesting whenever you explore parts of the canon, is how people try to, like, how you have to go through certain people. Like, I was always taken by Derrida when I was younger, when I was in my undergrad days, and I was very much aware that I had to try and understand Heidegger in some way if I had to try and understand Derrida. And so you find, like, reading certain people that you wouldn't necessarily want to read because of their personality, because of their personal history, you can find a way to kind of, like, means to an end sort of thinking. But on the way, you pick up certain things and you're like, oh, I quite like that. We'll take that. We'll use that. But no, it's fun. It's fun.
In terms of the evolution of the philosophy of film, do you think maybe in a hermeneutic vein that we can come to a better and better and better position from which to explicate our relationship to film and how it displays our cultural norms or maybe ideals or what have you? Or is this an everlasting spread of sort of scatter plot of
Yeah.
positions we might take up?
Yeah. No, it's a very, very, very good question. I think that, broadly speaking, we should always recall that we are within some kind of horizon, right? We are always interpreting things. I think that what a hermeneutics of film requires a re-engagement with the fact that one is interpreting movement. One is interpreting light and movement in some way. And that means it's kind of it's always like, without sounding too structuralist, it's always kind of a, a linguistic engagement with image and changing image, which means it's a linguistics that is continually changing in itself. So I think that whenever we come to think about interpretation and film, we have to begin with how we interpret art and then try and adapt that for movement somehow. The thing about movement that is always so distinct is that we can all conjure, we can follow, like meaning is deferred. I'm going to be thinking about Derrida now, but meaning is deferred like to an even greater depth than it would be otherwise, precisely because one image or one frame plus a second frame can create complete different structures of thinking, and that differs from person to person, right? So I always think that whenever it comes to film, we always have to try and think about how to interpret within a particular horizon whilst engaging with our own and trying to engage with the directors and the cinematographers and trying to imagine sort of like the horizon of characters themselves. So when we think about how can that move forward, I think that one of the things that has to be done is an engagement with hermeneutics that isn't so, I was about to say French, but that's really unfair, right? That isn't so bound up in sort of high concepts. Yeah, that isn't sort of bound up with high philosophy. Because the problem that I tend to find is that I enjoy reading Ricoeur. Like, Ricoeur would be a fantastic person to try and fold back into film, right? The problem that you have is that you'll find that the discourse would be between yourself and maybe 5 other scholars, because so few people really, really like can get to grips with that kind of discussion. Or even Gadamer. Like, I've spent a fair little bit of time trying to read Gadamer, and I find I'm very, very happy to sit and read him. The problem is that you have to constantly work at trying to interpret and reinterpret and try and find yourself in the horizon and try and like fuse your horizon with his, to use his own words. So the problem that you kind of have is that interpretation is just continual, right? Interpretation goes on and on and on, and sometimes that can be very, very difficult if you're stuck with someone, as I say, like Ricoeur, who you have to read again and again and again and again, and all of a sudden, like, the actual process of trying to read a text as well as an author understands it can just become exceptionally problematic. So I think that what is required for a hermeneutics of film is a greater openness to thinking about film as a text, film as text in the first place, but also without, as I say, like for want of a better phrase, without the guarded elitism of some kinds of philosophy. Just so to open the discourse. I mean, I always think that's a big thing anyway. Like, why, like a big one I always have is like, why do we have to refer to things in certain terms? Like, I mean, usual thing, why say it in one word when you can say it in 15? But but yeah, I think that that is very much a limitation on why there can be a hermeneutics of film. I also think one of the biggest difficulties is that there isn't this distinction between film and cinema enough, um, and that one has to be explored slightly more than the other and be separated from the other. I just think uh, we have to remove film from sitting in this realm of popular culture all the time, rather thinking of it more as a medium than anything else, as an artistic medium, rather than just being like, oh, it's something that we do to entertain ourselves. Right? I've never thought about going to a gallery to entertain myself. Like that's never really been my thought process. It's normally to try and like experience something, right? Or it's normally try and like, normally for me it's to like for the cachet of being like, oh, I've seen this painting in person, right? Right? Or like the other one that I always love is when you go into a gallery and you say, is that it? Right? I always like that. I always like that moment, right? But that's the thing I like. That's the kind of experience that I like. So I think that for hermeneutics of film to really transpire, what is required is a broadening of the language by which we can interpret film without making it too wordy, without making it too elitist, and then focusing on it as experience, not entertainment. And I think that's where that actually folds back into your question about like Marvel moving forward, is that I think one of the biggest problems is the focus is, this is actually something that Scorsese said, was that he thought that Marvel films were like a theme park, which is fun because I still don't view them like that. I still conceive of them as some kind of art. I don't know how, that's a different question, but I still conceive of them as some kind of art. But I think Marvel itself understands its remit as producing entertainment as opposed to producing an experience. Whereas film is, especially in cinema, is always experience. Just sort of on this, one of the things that I always recall was when you work in a theater, when you work in a cinema, you experience a lot of different things, right? Then obviously, like every job comes with its own thing. But one of the things that you do experience is an empty screen. I was blown away the first time I went in to do like a screen check where you make sure that you're contractually obliged to make sure that no one is filming a film when there's no one in the film, right? I was always amazed that the film still plays, which is nuts, because that means that you end up in this whole like question about like kind of like a kind of like an idealist question again about, well, who's the film for if there is no spectator? If there's no one spectating, does that mean that it's just playing? Does that just mean it's moving light? But does that mean that the only way that a film becomes cinema is when there is a spectator itself and when the light is refracting back? I don't know. There's lots of questions that come from that, I think. And that has to be folded back into the phenomenological aspects of what it is to interpret film. Going back to what it is to interpret cinema, is going back to that first sort of point I made on this, which is that we have to think of it in terms of movement and in terms of light and in terms of the physical aspect. And that's something that we don't do with other art forms, and that will enable us to pull it back into an experience. God, what a ramble.
I have a question about in creating a hermeneutics of film and thinking about film as art. Do you think that I mean, you said let's maybe get rid of some of these highfalutin concepts, make the conversation more open and accessible. Do you think that we would need a concept of beauty to talk about the intersection of aesthetics and ethics and epistemology and ontology, all of these different strata of philosophical discussion? Do we need beauty for that?
Oh, that's a good question. That is a good question. Okay, so as I say, like I'm a political theorist, so beauty is not something I deal with like at all in any way. But just sort of like a response to that isn't particularly well thought through. I think there does have to be some kind of consideration for beauty, but I don't know if that's what cinema goes for or should aim to, if we can talk about beauty as being an aim of anything in the first place. um I don't know, as I say, for me, I always tend to understand cinema as
Well, I think we have a dead image we were talking about earlier. Oh, frozen in time, a parade of death, fossilized moments. Oh no. Oh no. You were fossilized in time there for a second.
I was, wasn't I? Wasn't I? There we go. I can't remember what I was saying. Yeah, I think there does have to be some sort of discourse surrounding what beauty is. Again, I don't think that has to necessarily be like in any way. I mean, it can't be anything but intersubjective. But throw yourself into that intersubjectivity of beauty, right? I think that's really significant to engage in that discourse. Like I still maintain that as far as films are concerned, there are scenes in films that I find thoroughly mesmerizing and thoroughly like amazing in terms of what it is to draw light. um okay, so like a really good example of this, talking about animation earlier, is Kubo and the Two Strings, right? I find this an amazing film, not least because it's kind of like animation. And I've also written about this in the past in that kind of Bart's kind of way, about reanimation and sort of reanimation of life. But I think that there are parts of that I show other people, and they're like, Kieran's on one again, right? And whereas I'm there like, all right, there's something about the way the light is moving here that touches me in some way. And I think that's part of the experience that has to be focused on, is the very fact that precisely because cinema is aesthetic, or at least certainly because cinema engages with aesthetics broadly, that there has to be some sort of discourse, or at least intersubjective discourse, surrounding what beauty entails and its role in cinema. And what that even means as well, like for something to engage with beauty. Like I've already assumed that beauty is something that can be engaged with, as opposed to something that is sort of present without it, or something that is transcendent at least. Oh God, we're back to Kant again. Uh, but even so, um,
Oh, Jenna's got a great question going off of that. Do you think we have any obligations to appreciate cinema or film?
yes, okay. So not answer to the question, just yes. That was a good question. No, I don't think we have any obligation to that. Uh, I think that when we talk about any kind of, whenever we're talking about obligation, I think that obligations are either communal in the way that we draw them up, in the way that we conceive of obligations to one another, or they're sort of personally manufactured in the sense that we conceive of obligations to ourselves. I wouldn't suggest that a hermeneutics of film should entail obligations to an appreciation of cinema or film. In the same way, I would say that, oh, yeah, that's not a bad one. In the same way that I would say that one doesn't have to have an obligation to recognize or appreciate good or bad sport, right? Like I'm a cricket guy, right? Like I'm standardly English, right? Now there's a distinction between good cricket and bad cricket, and it's very, very clear when something is bad cricket. Saying that, however, I wouldn't suggest for a minute that anyone have an obligation to point out, this is good cricket, this is bad cricket. I think it's the same thing with cinema. I think that there isn't, we have an obligation only to acknowledge that we are interpreting it, just because I think that that's part and parcel of what it is to be human. is to be the being that interprets things. So I would say no, I don't think we have an obligation to do that, unless you want to cast yourself, unless you want to cast that obligation for yourself. But in which case, the question would be as to whether or not that's an obligation, right? Is something, is an obligation that you set for yourself still an obligation, or is it something more than that, right? Does it become goal, or does it become desire in itself in that regard? So yeah, I hope that answers that one.
Not to fold back into Kant again. um, on the flip side, do you think that there must be some sort of encounter of ugliness in this establishing of the hermeneutics of film, if not moral ugliness, or just, and it's kind of linking back to that ship of Theseus example when you talked about are the villains at play here, whether it be a moral ugliness or just an ugliness of taste. Is that at the groundwork?
Okay, one thing I will say is that one of the people that I lean a lot from, or I lean on a lot, and I know she has a lot of discourse about this, is Hannah Arendt. And I know that one of the things that Arendt discusses in one of her essays called On Thinking and Moral Considerations is that she talks about a lot about Kant's critique of judgment. And I do think that part and parcel of being able to judge something is being able to coherently determine whether something is beautiful or ugly. I do think that's true. I still maintain that that is part and parcel of rational discourse. I think we can include ugliness into a hermeneutics of film or a hermeneutics of cinema. And I think, again, I think it not depends on how one casts ugliness, but I think that would hinge on how one understands beauty and whether or not you can, actually, that's even more complicated, right? Whether or not one can cast them as being in a dyad, I think is kind of interesting. Like, are they actually like opposites of one another, right? Or does beauty always entail some mode of ugliness to itself in some regard, perhaps?
Ugliness and privation.
Yeah, right. I see. You remember that. So I think that yeah. So I think that it would entail some mode of ugliness. Sure, I think that is part and parcel of being able to judge. One of the things that I think is really significant, and I wish Arendt had written about this. She would have done at some point. I'm sure, but is the way in which judgment and interpretation are very, very close to one another. I think that it's very difficult to interpret something without necessarily casting a concrete judgment in some way. Interpretation can shift, it can ebb and flow. One can find oneself in the horizon of another, one can fuse one's own horizon with that of another. And judgments can shift, but judgment is always taking place in some regard. It's just unfolding and overlapping and enveloping in different ways. So yeah, I think in that regard, yeah, sure, let's chuck in ugliness in the hermeneutics of film as well. Why not? There have been plenty of films where I've watched and I've been like, what sort of like what sort of like cinematography is that? That's awful.
I watched the Leprechaun series for
Yeah.
Halloween. I had never seen it before. And once I got to like 3 or 4, I said, okay, I've had enough of this ugliness. It was appropriate for Halloween, but
yeah. Did you get to the leprechaun in space?
that's when I drew the line. It's like when
Right,
they put the Power Rangers in space, and I said, oh, that's enough. No,
yeah,
no.
right.
I don't need to be sending people to space. Okay.
I'll tell you what, like, yeah, the next one, Harry Potter in space. That's going to be amazing.
Oh. Well, any further questions in the chat? How we feeling over there? Good. Well, I've exhausted my questions myself. So while people are thinking about that, I do want to thank you for joining us. This has been an excellent conversation, very exciting. With so many themes, I didn't know exactly what would come up. But I thoroughly enjoyed the after conversation. That was fantastic.
I'm glad. I'm glad. I'd certainly too. So as I say, it's nice to be asked questions. Doesn't normally happen. Not outside like me being like, oh, I have an answer. But yeah, definitely so.
Well, thank you, Jenna and Victoria, for also contributing to this event
Thank you.
with your questions and your presence. And it's always wonderful to have folks from our study group joining us. So yeah, thank you so much. We'll hope to be seeing and hearing more from you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to come on once again. It was ever such an honor to be asked to come on. So thank you.
All right, well, goodbye, everyone.
See you.